The cafe was buzzing with life. It was one of those trendy spots in London, filled with intellectuals, journalists, and self-proclaimed critics of everything under the sun. And tonight, the center of attention was none other than Mohammed Salah, the footballing icon known for his humility as much as his skills. He was seated at a corner table, sipping a quiet cup of tea, oblivious to the storm brewing just a few feet away. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the legend himself, Mohammed Salah, the man who thinks football is more important than progress, who clings to outdated beliefs while pretending to be a modern icon. The words cut through the air like a knife. The speaker, Jonathan Reeves, a well-known liberal journalist with a reputation for tearing public figures apart. He stood with his arms crossed, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he addressed the entire room, making sure Salah could hear him. Some people chuckled nervously, others shifted uncomfortably. Salah didn't flinch. He simply looked up, meeting Jonathan's gaze with an unreadable expression. Jonathan wasn't done. Tell me, Salah, does fasting during Ramadan make you slower on the pitch? Or do you rely on some divine intervention to keep you running? Laughter rippled through the room, but it was uneasy, forced. Salah put his cup down gently. The air was thick with anticipation. Would he lash out? Ignore it. Instead, he did something no one expected. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made the room go silent. Then he stood up. I appreciate your concern for my performance, Jonathan, Salah said calmly, his voice carrying just enough authority to make everyone lean in. But let me ask you something. If faith makes a man weak, why do the strongest people in history stand by theirs? Jonathan's smirk faltered. Salah took a step closer, his tone still light but laced with something sharp. You see, football isn't just about skill. It's about discipline, respect, and endurance. And those values? They come from belief, whether in yourself, your team, or something greater. A hush fell over the room. Jonathan, for the first time, had nothing to say, and that was just the beginning. Stay tuned for the next chapter, where Jonathan tries to turn the tables, but Salah isn't done surprising him yet. You said, 2ChatGPT said, Episode 2, the bet Jonathan Reeves wasn't used to being outmaneuvered, especially not in his own game. Public humiliation. He straightened his jacket, his ego bruised but not broken. The silence in the cafe was suffocating, thick with the weight of Salah's words. He needed to take control again. Discipline, respect, endurance. Jonathan scoffed, forcing a chuckle as he grabbed his coffee. That's a nice little speech, Salah, but let's be real. Football is about talent and strategy, not outdated religious traditions. And let's face it, if you weren't a top player, no one would care about your so-called values. Murmurs spread through the room. Salah tilted his head slightly, as if considering the words carefully. He wasn't rattled. If anything, he seemed amused. So, what are you saying, Jonathan? Salah asked, his voice calm. That belief has no place in success. I'm saying that without your physical ability, all the fasting, all the praying, all the discipline in the world wouldn't get you anywhere. Jonathan leaned in, a smirk creeping back onto his face. Tell you what, why don't we put your faith to the test? A challenge. Now people were really paying attention. Salah raised an eyebrow. Go on. Jonathan grinned. You're in peak condition, right? A professional athlete. And you fast during Ramadan. How about this? You play a match against an opponent of my choosing in a completely fasted state, and if you win, I'll publicly admit that faith isn't a weakness. But if you lose, he paused, savoring the moment. You drop the inspiration act and admit that your success is purely your own doing. No God, No faith, just skill and hard work. Gasps rippled through the crowd. It was a ridiculous bet, a setup, but instead of getting angry, Sulla simply smiled. You believe my success is only about talent, and I believe discipline and faith are what make the difference. He took a sip of his tea, then nodded. Fine. I accept. The room erupted in whispers. Jonathan looked victorious. He had backed Sulla into a corner, or so he thought, because what he didn't know was that Sulla had never lost a battle that mattered. And this was about to become legendary. The challenge spread like wildfire. Within hours, social media exploded with debates, memes, and predictions. News outlets picked up the story, and the public was divided. Some believed Sulla's faith would make him stronger, while others sided with Jonathan, convinced that fasting would weaken even the greatest athlete. The match was set for the weekend, and the stakes were clear. If Sulla won, Jonathan would publicly acknowledge that faith played a role in success. If he lost, he would have to admit that his achievements were purely physical. No faith, no divine help, just raw talent. But Jonathan wasn't leaving anything to chance. He had handpicked Sulla's opponent, Lucas Moreno, a retired footballer still in top shape, known for his aggressive style and ruthless gameplay. Unlike Sulla, Lucas would be fully hydrated, well-fed, and playing with every advantage possible. You sure you want to go through with this? Sulla's longtime friend and agent, Kareem, asked as they stood on the practice field. Sulla simply smiled. It's not about winning or losing, Kareem. It's about showing that faith isn't a limitation. Kareem shook his head. Yeah, well, don't forget, Jonathan isn't doing this for a fair debate. He's doing this to humiliate you. Sulla stretched his legs, calm as ever. Then let's make sure he learns something. Match day, the stadium wasn't packed like a Premier League final, but the energy was just as intense. Cameras were rolling, fans had gathered, and Jonathan sat confidently in the VIP section, sipping his coffee, ready to watch Sulla crumble under the weight of his own beliefs. Lucas Moreno stood across from Sulla, bouncing on his toes. You sure you want to do this, mate? He asked with a smirk. You're running on empty. Sulla just nodded. Let's play. The whistle blew. From the start, it was clear Lucas was playing dirty. Hard tackles, strategic body checks, even subtle shirt pulling. He was testing Sulla's endurance, waiting for the moment his energy would run out. Jonathan leaned forward in his seat, grinning as Sulla started to slow. The fasting had to be catching up to him. Any minute now, but something was off. Sulla wasn't breaking. He was adjusting. He moved smarter, reading Lucas's plays before they happened, conserving his energy, striking when it mattered. And then, bam, with a perfectly timed dribble, Sulla danced past Lucas and fired a shot straight into the top corner of the net. The crowd erupted. Jonathan's smirk vanished. Sulla turned, breathing steadily, his eyes locked on Jonathan. This game wasn't over. IT was just getting started. Jonathan gripped the edge of his seat, his fingers tightening around his coffee cup. That goal wasn't supposed to happen. Sulla was supposed to be exhausted, dragging his feet, struggling to keep up. Instead, he was playing like a man with something greater fueling him on the field. Lucas Moreno wiped sweat from his brow, glaring at Sulla. Lucky shot, he muttered. Sulla just smiled. Was it? The game resumed, and Lucas went all in. His tackles became rougher, his movements sharper. He was a seasoned player. He knew how to wear an opponent down, and he was determined to prove that fasting made Sulla weaker. But something wasn't adding up, and no matter how many times Lucas pressed, Sulla didn't slow. He wasn't reckless, wasn't wasting energy on unnecessary sprints. He was patient, calculating. Every step he took was deliberate. Jonathan leaned over to his assistant. "He's got to be running on fumes by now," he hissed. The assistant hesitated. "Maybe, but he doesn't look like it." And then it happened. Lucas saw an opening. Sulla had just made a long run, and for the first time, he looked a little off balance. This was the moment. Lucas charged forward, pushing his body to the max, ready to snatch the ball and even the score. But Sulla wasn't off balance in one smooth motion. He flicked the ball between Lucas's legs with a perfect nutmeg, spun around him, and sprinted toward the goal. The crowd gasped. Even the referee looked impressed. Lucas was frozen in place, stunned. Jonathan's face paled. Sulla was now one-on-one with the goalkeeper. With effortless precision, he chipped the ball over the keeper's head. It hit the back of the net. Goal. The stadium erupted. Fans were on their feet, chanting his name. Sulla jogged back, calm as ever, but this time his eyes locked onto Jonathan's. The journalist swallowed hard. This wasn't going how he had planned. And worst of all, he was starting to realize Sulla wasn't winning despite his fasting, that he was winning because of it. Jonathan Reeves was sweating now, though he'd never admit it. His smug confidence had been replaced by an uneasy frustration. This was supposed to be a lesson, his lesson, where he exposed Sulla's so-called faith as a weakness. But instead, Sulla was dominating. Jonathan's jaw tightened as he watched Lucas Moreno stand there, hands on his hips, shaking his head in disbelief. The veteran footballer had thrown everything at Sulla, but the Egyptian wasn't breaking. If anything, he was getting sharper. Jonathan had underestimated him. He slammed his coffee down onto the table, spilling some onto his notes. "This isn't over," he muttered. Then he leaned toward his assistant. "Give me Lucas on the phone." Now, on the field, Lucas finally jogged up to Sulla, breathing hard. "All right, man," he muttered under his breath. "What the hell is this?" Sulla just gave him a calm smile. "What do you mean?" Lucas frowned. "You should be drained by now. No food, no water. You should be struggling." Sulla exhaled, glancing up at the sky for a brief moment before returning his focus to Lucas. "You're relying on your body," he said simply. "I'm relying on something more." Lucas didn't respond. He wasn't a religious man, but he couldn't deny what he was seeing. Still, he wasn't about to let Sulla make a fool of him. As the referee signaled for play to resume, Lucas glanced toward the VIP section. His phone, left on the bench, vibrated. A message from Jonathan popped up. "Take him down. Make it count." Lucas clenched his jaw. He knew exactly what that meant. The whistle blew. This time, when Sulla received the ball, Lucas didn't go for a fair challenge. Instead, he lunged in hard, sweeping Sulla's legs out from under him with a brutal tackle. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as Sulla hit the ground with force, rolling over in pain. The referee's whistle blared, signaling a foul, but the damage was done. Jonathan smirked. That should slow him down. The camera zoomed in on Sulla as he clutched his ankle. Was this it? Was this where the so-called power of faith crumbled under reality? Lucas stood over him, offering a hand. But Sulla didn't take it. Instead, he closed his eyes for a brief second. And when he opened them again, he stood up. The stadium roared as Jonathan's smirk vanished. Sulla rolled his shoulders, took a deep breath, and jogged back into position. He wasn't limping. He wasn't slowing down. If anything, he looked stronger. Lucas stared at him, bewildered. "You're not human," he muttered. Sulla smiled. "I never said I was doing this alone." Jonathan felt something he hadn't felt in years, doubt. And for the first time, he realized he might be on the losing side of his own game. Jonathan Reeves was losing control. This wasn't just a football match anymore. This was a public reckoning, and Sulla wasn't just winning on the field. He was proving something far bigger. Jonathan clenched his fists as he watched Sulla rise to his feet like nothing had happened. Lucas had hit him with everything, and yet he still stood. No limping, no hesitation, just unwavering focus. This wasn't possible. Lucas, still catching his breath, muttered under his breath, "Man, you're insane." Sulla smiled, adjusting his stance. "No," he said, "I'm just prepared." The referee signaled for the game to continue, that Jonathan's mind raced. He couldn't let this happen. If Sulla won, it wouldn't just be a victory on the pitch. It would be a direct humiliation for him. His entire argument, his entire brand, was based on the idea that faith was an illusion, a crutch. And yet, here was Muhammad Salah, proving that faith wasn't a weakness. It was his greatest strength. Jonathan's pulse quickened. He needed an out, a way to spin this. Something, anything, to regain control of the narrative. And then an idea struck him. He leaned over to his assistant. "Make the call," he muttered. Now, the final minutes on the field, Lucas was playing more cautiously now. He had seen what happened when he went all in against Sulla, but he still had pride. He wasn't about to go down without a fight. The clock was winding down. Sulla's team was leading, and Lucas knew he had to act fast. He charged in again, trying to close the space. But Sulla had already read the play. With a flick of his foot, he cut past Lucas effortlessly. Then in a blur, he exploded forward. The crowd erupted as Sulla broke away, sprinting toward the goal, his speed unbelievable for a man who hadn't eaten or drunk anything in hours. Jonathan's eyes widened in horror. This wasn't supposed to happen. Sulla reached the penalty box. The goalkeeper lunged, desperate to stop him. But Sulla didn't shoot. Instead, he did something no one expected. At the last second, he slowed down and passed the ball to a teammate running alongside him. With an easy tap, the ball rolled into the net. Goal. The stadium exploded. The crowd went wild. Sulla wasn't just winning. He was playing with humility, with teamwork, with grace. He wasn't out to humiliate Lucas. He wasn't playing for revenge. He was playing for something greater. Jonathan's vision blurred as the chants of Sulla, Sulla, Sulla filled the air. His plan had failed. And worst of all, the world had just witnessed exactly what faith could do. Jonathan Reeves sat frozen in his seat, his heart pounding in his chest. This was a disaster. Sulla hadn't just won. He had done it with humility, grace, and unwavering belief. The Egyptian forward had every reason to take the glory for himself, to prove a personal point. Yet he had passed the ball, proving that his faith wasn't about it was about something bigger. The stadium was roaring. Fans were chanting Sulla's name. Cameras zoomed in on him as he embraced his teammates, his face calm, his body language composed. That Jonathan's phone buzzed. Assistant, "Jonathan, you're trending." And not in a good way. He exhaled sharply, flipping open Twitter. Trending topics: Sulla masterclass, faith is strength, Jonathan exposed. He clicked on the last one. His screen flooded with posts. Jonathan Reeves tried to humiliate Sulla, and Sulla just walked through him like a ghost. Unbelievable. So let me get this straight. Reeves mocked Sulla, set up a rigged match, and Sulla still dominated? Faced with tears of joy, the guy just buried his own argument. Reeves' whole thing was faith makes you weak, and yet Sulla just ran circles around a fully fed, fully hydrated opponent while fasting. I think we know who the real weak one is. Jonathan's stomach twisted. This wasn't just backlash. This was a reckoning that he had spent years branding himself as the ultimate intellectual, the fearless journalist who took down outdated beliefs. But tonight, he had made the mistake of choosing the wrong opponent. And Sulla hadn't just beaten him, he had erased the entire foundation of Jonathan's argument in front of millions. Jonathan slammed his phone down, his jaw clenched. No, this wasn't over. It couldn't be. He had one last move left. Post-match, interview reporters crowded Salah as he stepped off the field. The glow of stadium lights reflected off the sweat on his brow. But his expression remained humble, unshaken. One journalist finally asked the question on everyone's mind. Muhammed, this was more than just a game tonight. This was a statement. What do you have to say to Jonathan Reeves and those who doubted you? Salah paused, considering his words carefully. Then, with a small smile, he spoke. Football is a game of skill, yes. But more than that, it's a game of discipline, of patience, of belief. People think fasting weakens me, but that's because they don't understand. Strength isn't just about what you put in your body. It's about what you carry in your heart. The crowd erupted in cheers. Jonathan, watching from the VIP section, felt his stomach drop. Then, Salah turned to face the camera directly, looking straight through the lens, straight through Jonathan. Doubt is easy. Faith is hard. But in the end, only one of them makes you stronger. Jonathan swallowed hard, because for the first time in his career, he had no words left to say. Jonathan Reeves felt like he was drowning. Every news outlet, every social media post, every football pundit, they were all talking about Salah, about his resilience, his discipline, his unshakable belief. And Jonathan? He was the punchline that he paced in his hotel room, his laptop open to a blank document. This was his moment to regain control, to twist the narrative before it crushed him completely. He cracked his knuckles, exhaled, and started typing. The myth of Mohamed Salah. Why emotion shouldn't replace science in football, his argument. Simple. Salah hadn't won because of faith. He had won despite it. His years of training, his natural talent, his elite conditioning. That was what mattered. Not fasting. Not belief. Not some mystical inner strength. He would frame it logically, make it sound intellectual, play to the skeptics, to those who secretly hated seeing faith celebrated. He would remind the world that this was just football, not a philosophical debate. That a smirk crept onto his face. This would work. It had to. He hit publish. The internet's response, it took only minutes for the backlash to start. Jonathan Reeves just posted the saltiest article of all time. Man got outplayed and is still trying to downplay it. This is embarrassing. Reeves can't admit he was wrong. So now he's writing essays about why faith doesn't matter, after getting humbled by it in real time. Imagine watching a man fast for 14 hours, destroy a fully fueled opponent, and still thinking he had no advantage. Delusion at its peak. Jonathan's hands clenched. He had spent his career tearing down others. He never thought he'd be the one being torn apart. And then a notification popped up. Mohamed Salah has responded. Salah's response wasn't a long thread. Wasn't a press conference, wasn't some deep rebuttal. It was just one simple post, that a photo, Salah kneeling on the pitch in sujud, thanking God, and a caption. They will always try to explain away faith. But faith doesn't need an explanation. It speaks for itself. The post went viral within seconds. Jonathan stared at the screen, his face pale. He had lost. Not just the argument, not just the match, but the battle for public opinion. Because at the end of the day, no matter how hard he tried to deny it, the world had already seen the truth for themselves. Jonathan Reeves sat alone in his dimly lit hotel room, the glow of his laptop screen casting eerie shadows on his face. He refreshed the page for the 100th time, hoping the tide had shifted. It hadn't. His article, the one he had poured his desperation into, was being ripped apart. The comments were brutal, unforgiving. Reeves took an L so hard he's trying to rebrand reality. Just take the loss, man. The irony is incredible. He mocked faith, called it an illusion, and then got utterly wrecked by a man who was fasting. Salah didn't just win the match. He won the argument. And now Reeves is scrambling to make sense of it. The weight of it all settled in Jonathan's chest like a stone. He had spent years tearing down belief, priding himself on cold, calculated logic. But none of that had mattered when he sat in that stadium, watching Salah stand tall after every hit, every challenge, every attempt to break him. He had expected to expose Salah. Instead, he had exposed himself to career in freefall. Jonathan's phone rang. His editor. He hesitated before answering. Jonathan. The voice on the other end was tight, measured. We need to talk. He exhaled. I know. This article, it's not landing the way you think it is. The backlash is bad. Our credibility is on the line here. Jonathan pinched the bridge of his nose. So what? You want me to retract it? A pause. We're saying nothing yet. But listen to me. This whole faith versus science angle, it's not working. Salah didn't just beat an opponent. He beat you. And people can see that. You need to lay low for a while. Jonathan's grip tightened on the phone. You're saying I should disappear? I'm saying, his editor sighed, you picked the wrong fight. The line went dead. Jonathan tossed his phone onto the bed, running a hand through his hair. For the first time in his career, he had no comeback, but a moment of reflection. He turned his attention back to Salah's post. The image of him kneeling in sujud, the simple yet devastating caption. They will always try to explain away faith. But faith doesn't need an explanation. It speaks for itself. Jonathan exhaled sharply, his mind flashing back to the match, the way Salah had moved, the way he had endured, the way he had smiled, not with arrogance, but with certainty. Jonathan had mocked him, humiliated him, set him up to fail. And yet, Salah had responded not with anger, not with insults, but with grace. Jonathan's throat tightened. He had spent years convincing himself that faith was a weakness. But now, sitting here, job on the line, reputation in ruins, ego shattered, he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong. Jonathan Reeves had spent his entire career standing firm in his beliefs, tearing down what he saw as illusions. Faith, religion, devotion, he had always viewed them as mere crutches, comforting lies people told themselves to feel stronger. But now he wasn't so sure. The hotel room felt suffocating, the walls closing in as he stared at Salah's viral post. That single image, Salah in sujud, head to the ground in gratitude, had done something Jonathan never thought possible. That IT had silenced him. His mind flashed back to the game. The brutal tackles, the exhaustion, the pressure. And yet, Salah had never wavered. Not once. Jonathan had everything on his side. Logic, science, preparation. Yet he had watched a man who was physically disadvantaged rise above it all. And not just with skill, but with something deeper. Something Jonathan couldn't explain. At a crossroads, his phone buzzed again. His editor. He let it ring out. For once, he didn't care about controlling the narrative. Instead, he did something that surprised even himself. He closed his laptop, grabbed his jacket, and stepped outside. The London's crisp night air hit his face as he walked aimlessly, his thoughts louder than the city noise around him. He found himself wandering past cafes, bookstores, places he had passed 1,000 times but never really seen. He ended up at a small park bench, sitting down, staring up at the sky. And then a voice. You look like a man searching for something. Jonathan turned. An older man sat beside him, dressed in a simple white thobe, prayer beads in his hand. Jonathan hesitated. Just thinking. The man nodded, a knowing smile on his lips. Thinking is good, but sometimes what we seek is not in the mind. He tapped his chest. It is here. Jonathan swallowed. He should have brushed the man off, should have walked away. But instead, for the first time in his life, he asked a question he never thought he'd ask. How do you believe in something you can't prove? The man smiled. The question of every skeptic. He looked up at the sky. Tell me, can you see the wind? Jonathan frowned. No, but you feel it, the man finished for him. You see its effects. You know it is there, even if your eyes cannot capture it. Jonathan fell silent. The man stood, giving him one last look. The truth is already in front of you, my friend. The question is, are you willing to see it? And with that, he walked away, leaving Jonathan alone with his thoughts. The beginning of something new. Jonathan sat there for a long time. The old version of him, the man who mocked faith, who demanded evidence for everything, would have dismissed that conversation. But that version of him had been shaken to the core. For the first time in his life, he wasn't searching for an argument. He was searching for the truth. And maybe, just maybe, he was ready to find it. The end. Final thoughts. Muhammed Salah didn't just win a football match. He won something much greater. A battle of belief, of resilience, of truth. And for Jonathan Reeves, what started as an attempt to tear down faith ended with him questioning everything he ever believed. Because in the end, faith doesn't need to be explained. It just needs to be felt.